The night my neighbor climbed into the back seat of my car, I thought she was simply trying to escape the cold. I had no idea that in the next few minutes, she would tell me something that would change the way I saw her, and myself, forever. The drive-in screen was glowing across the dark field, the smell of popcorn drifting through the cool evening air, and yet she looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered that the movie could wait. If you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes, one small act of kindness can become the beginning of an entirely different life. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, I had become comfortable being alone. After my divorce, I stopped making plans. I went to work, came home, cooked simple dinners, watched television, and went to bed. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I just didn't expect much from life anymore. Then, 3 months earlier, a woman named Emily moved into the small house next to mine. She was quiet, polite, and strangely careful about everything. She always smiled when we crossed paths, but there was something behind that smile that I couldn't explain. She carried groceries with one hand while holding her phone tightly in the other, as though she was always waiting for bad news. One Saturday afternoon, I noticed her sitting alone on her porch. She looked exhausted. Without thinking too much about it, I asked if she wanted to go to the drive-in movie that evening. There was an old classic playing, and I figured a couple of hours under the stars might be good for both of us. To my surprise, she agreed. That evening, Emily arrived wearing a simple blue sweater and carrying a small blanket. She seemed nervous at first, but as we drove toward the theater, she slowly relaxed. We talked about ordinary things, bad coffee, old movies, childhood memories, and the strange habits of neighbors. For the first time since moving in, I heard her laugh. At the drive-in, I parked near the back of the lot. The giant screen illuminated the darkness, and dozens of cars surrounded us. Emily watched the opening scene for several minutes before suddenly becoming quiet. Then she looked toward the rearview mirror. Her face had gone pale. I asked if she was okay, but she didn't answer. She stared toward the entrance of the drive-in as if she had seen someone she desperately hoped she would never see again. A few seconds later, she unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the passenger door, and climbed into the back seat. I turned around in confusion. She pulled the blanket around herself and whispered that the movie could wait. There was fear in her voice. I didn't ask unnecessary questions. I simply turned off the sound and locked the doors. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emily told me that the man standing near the entrance was her former fiancé. Their relationship had ended badly months earlier, but he had refused to accept that it was over. She had moved to the neighborhood because she believed distance would finally give her peace. She hadn't told anyone because she was embarrassed. I told her she had nothing to be embarrassed about. Then she began to cry. She explained that after losing her job and ending her engagement, she had spent months believing she was somehow broken. She had stopped answering friends, stopped trusting people, and convinced herself that asking for help made her weak. I understood more than she realized. Because after my divorce, I had done almost the same thing. I told her that sometimes people don't need someone to fix their lives. Sometimes they just need someone to sit beside them until the fear becomes smaller. We stayed in that car for almost an hour. Eventually, the man left. Emily didn't want to watch the movie anymore, so we drove home. But before she got out, she thanked me for not asking her to explain everything before believing her. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. Emily stood outside holding 2 cups of coffee. She told me she had finally decided to report the harassment and speak with people she trusted. She had also called an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Over the following weeks, something changed. Emily began rebuilding her life. She found another job. She started taking walks again. She began laughing more. And strangely enough, I started changing too. I began cooking real meals. I started meeting old friends. I even joined a community volunteer group because Emily had convinced me that helping others was a good way to stop living inside your own pain. Months passed. One Friday evening, I found 2 tickets sitting on my porch. They were for another drive-in movie. Emily stood behind them, smiling. This time, there was no fear in her eyes. We went back to the same theater. The same rows of cars filled the field, and the same giant screen lit up the night. But everything felt different. Halfway through the movie, Emily looked at me and smiled. She told me that night in the car had been the moment she realized she wasn't alone anymore. I told her that it had been the same moment for me. We both laughed. The movie ended, but neither of us rushed home. We sat beneath the stars, listening to the quiet sounds of cars leaving the theater. I realized then that life rarely changes through grand miracles. Sometimes it changes through a simple invitation, a warm cup of coffee, a locked car door when someone is frightened, or one person deciding to stay when another person expects everyone to leave. Emily eventually became one of my closest friends. And I became someone who no longer believed that being alone was the same thing as being strong. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may need a little hope today, and leave a comment. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. And before you leave, I have one special request. Comment, kindness can change a life, if you believe that one small act of compassion can make a difference. Because sometimes, the movie really can wait. Sometimes, what matters most is the person sitting beside you, quietly hoping someone will stay.